first question, why do states and political factions shift alliances in the Middle East?
Well, in order for me to be able to answer such a question and deal with it, one has to look at the region from a total perspective. There is a tendency among all superpowers and major powers to achieve stability everywhere in the world, and specifically in the region. However, stability is perceived from different powers in a different way. We have a tendency among the decision makers in the United States to think of stability as being achieved through two means. First mean is democracy, and the second mean is through what's so-called balance of power. Now, if we put this perspective as being one of the ways of looking at stability, and we move to the second perspective, which is competing with the first, then we see that there is a tendency where stability is sought. However, means to achieve this stability is through two other ways. It's either by military supremacy or by what's so-called aggregations of power, not balance of power. So here we have two projects: democracy, military supremacy. We have balance of power or aggregation of power. Both of these two are being supported by superpowers and major powers that have influence in the Middle East, and they are somehow opposing one another, feuding with one another. Now, to be able to understand the sequence of events as it is taking place now in the Middle East, in the different countries, we have to look at an attempt at trying, on the one hand, to democratize, because democracies would lead to stability, create a balance of power which is very difficult to take place unless you could assemble some kind of an alliance. Now, the assembling of alliances sometimes requires the shifting of positions of certain factions, certain states, from being at one time an ally of a tendency to become an ally of a second tendency, depending on the self-interest of each of these parties, whether it is a state or whether it is a political movement or whether it is a political party. Mm-hmm. Now, the shifting is still in the process, meaning the shifting of alliances is still in the process, starting from the time when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1989, 1990, up to this point in time, we are in the 2015. If we are to trace the history of the political processes in terms of foreign policy of every single actor in the Middle East, and here what I mean by actor, meaning an influential actor, whether it is a state or an organization, a strong organization. If we follow the process, then we're going to see that many times they have moved from being pro to being anti one of these factions, meaning from being, for instance, against Iran to becoming somehow being supported by Iran. If we look at the Kurdish movements in Iraq right now, and you see that they have had this kind of animosity against Turkey and Iran, now they are being supported heavily by Iran and supported heavily by Turkey, and they need this support. So there is some kind of an unannounced alliance there, at least in the military domain, to be able to face ISIL or ISIS. Other states are the same, meaning from being, for instance, like if we take Egypt, or if we take, for instance, a disintegrating country like Libya, with the different factions within Libya, or if we look at, for instance, Yemen, Muhammad Ali Saleh and his shifting alliances between being pro-Saudi Arabia to be anti-Saudi Arabia, now he's becoming pro-Iranian. As a state, the governments of these states usually have their own position with regard to alliances. However, if it is a weak state where we could see that it has a government, but the government is not really effective, then the organizations within the government becomes more effective. And in this case, you could take Yemen or Lebanon, for instance, and you could see that these are the shifting alliances on two levels. We cannot consider only that the state is shifting these alliances, because sometimes the government of the state would shift an alliance. However, stronger organizations within the state that are more powerful than the government, sometimes they shift alliances in a completely different directions. However, to answer the question, shifting of alliances is always related to the two projects that are competing in the Middle East, both for stability, but they are using completely different means for the attainment of this objective.
Okay. Second question, how much does do the proxy wars in the Middle East explain the redrawing of a new balance of power in the region?
Well, maybe this question is very much related to the first question. But we're here concentrating on the means, which is how do we achieve something by using a specific mean. Meaning, if we are interested in achieving balance of power, and there are obstacles standing in really making one group equal in power with another group, meaning an alliance of organizations and states balanced in power with another alliance. Because if they are balanced, then they will have equal fear, then stability. Sometimes it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen easily. And if this is to continue where you have dominance, it means you have instability, because those that are dominated, especially if they are the majority, are going to rebel. So you have a weak majority opposing a strong minority, and here we're talking about military power. And some kind of an imbalance is going to create instability here. Now, to be able to balance these powers, then sometimes certain states would see that a military intervention is a necessity, but they don't want to intervene directly. So what they do is that they create factions within the country where they want to interfere. They support these factions, they finance these factions, they indoctrinate these factions, they provide them with weapons, and sometimes with what's so-called logistical supports, and in many times even legal supports, like these are opposition groups, or these are groups that are claiming their rights in providing for a better society. This kind of indirect intervention and the creation and development of these groups are labeled as being proxy groups. Ultimately, by time, they lose power of running their own affairs, and they start to work in the direction of protecting the interests of those that are supporting them with money and supporting them with the logistics, and they become very much dependent to the point in which, for their own survival, they cannot say no to the patron country that is supporting them, because they are already now in a position where if they lose their patron, then they will be extinct. They would be facing major problems. Part of what's going on in the Middle East right now, if we are to understand the difficulty in being able to assess the balances between these alliances, is because almost all regional powers have proxy groups in so many different Arab countries that are working for them, trying to redraw what's so-called the balance of power in the Middle East. And here I could say, for instance, you have Arabian Gulf states that have proxy militias in Lebanon, that they have proxy militias in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and elsewhere in the Arab world, starting from Yemen, all the way to, for instance, if we to include Iran, for instance, then you have Bahrain, and you have it even in Palestine, and so on and so forth. I hope I gave enough information to justify both questions.